back to E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA. I'm your host, Nathan Resnick, joined by my co-host, Aaron Alpeter. Aaron, how's it going today?
I'm doing pretty good, Nathan. How are you doing?
Amazing. So I'm excited to talk about Lovesac because, they're kind of a bit of a local Utah story. I've met the founder before, but before we talk about Lovesac on this episode of E-commerce on Tap, can you give the audience a quick overview of what E-commerce on Tap is for those that are tuning in for the first time?
Yeah, so this is a podcast that we're doing out of love, it feels like. But what we do is we look at a well-known D2C company. We tell their founding story, reverse engineer their supply chain, and talk about their X potential. And really our goal is to try to glean insights that we can apply to other businesses that we're working with.
100%. And I guess before we dive in, did you see any tidbits that caught your eye this past week?
Yeah, there were two things that caught my eye. The first one, I don't know if you saw this, but the former Surgeon General wrote an op-ed in the New York Times where he basically advocated putting a disclaimer on social media platforms, basically the same that you would have for a pack of cigarettes. And so his perspective is that social media that's unregulated is so harmful to particularly teenagers that we got to put a warning label on it. And so that was something that is certainly getting a lot of notoriety. I can't say that I disagree with them. I don't know if it will make that big of a difference if there's a pop-up that people click through, but this is certainly getting an interesting conversation going.
Yeah, that is pretty neat. What caught my eye is, we covered athletic brewing in one of the episodes of E-commerce on Tap that I love, and they were just recently named the 10th best producing craft brewery in America. So I think it's neat that number one, they're kind of considered a craft beer company, even though they're non-alcoholic. And number two, top 10 is exceptional. I mean, they've really just grown tremendously and done exceptionally well. And then what else caught my eye was Outdoor Voices, which was a brand that I actually first heard about through my mom because she lives in Austin, Texas, and they were based in Texas. And they grew like pretty well. They had raised quite a bit of capital. Outdoor Voices, you should Google them if you haven't heard about them before, but they filed for bankruptcy, and Consortium Brand Partners has bought them out of their auction from bankruptcy. So I'm pretty sure they're going to come back, hopefully in a better form and better positioning to really kind of see their full potential, because I think it was a great brand that just kind of hit leadership and financial challenges, unfortunately.
Yeah, they had a lot of issues. Some of them of their doing, some of them not, but that would be an interesting story to dig into one time.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe we'll do like a comeback episode of Outdoor Voices. That would be pretty cool. Well, today we're talking about Lovesac. So Lovesac is an American furniture retailer. They really emphasize sustainable and durable products that are designed to last a lifetime. And their founding story is pretty fascinating. So I guess, Aaron, do you want to kind of tee us off with a bit of an introduction and then, the history of, couches, basically?
Yeah, well, I figured it'd be fun. Like, do you have a good couch story? I've got a couple, but do you have a good couch story from your life so far?
It's a good question. I mean, I personally I guess when it comes to whenever I move, I hate moving furniture. And so usually I, in general, buy cheaper furniture because I don't want to move it and just want to, toss it or sell it for cheap or whatever it may be when I move. I will say now that, I own a house, I don't know if it's called an investment, but I have bought, furniture that I definitely will not throw away whenever I move. So, I would say it's interesting because when I think about couches, I think about just how heavy they are and how hard they are to move. But, I know some people, they spend, just an insane amount of money on couches.
Yeah, I'm convinced that you can spend any amount of money you want to on a couch. If you want to spend $50,000 on a couch, you can do that. If you want to spend $1, you can do that. My couch story, I actually apparently have a lot of couch stories as I was walking through, just preparing for this episode. And one of the things that came to my mind initially was my freshman year of college. It was at Case Western. And a lot of the friends that I had in the cross country team had a house together. And for whatever reason, they decided that they were just going to collect any couch that they saw on the side of the road. And so over the course of a few months, they collected like 11 couches, and they basically like filled up their entire house with couches, where they had couches on top of couches and built like stadium seating and all this other sort of stuff. And it was just kind of this funny thing of like, haha, yeah, we got all these couches. But I feel like it's a very college thing to do.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I would say a college thing to do, but it's pretty neat. It goes to show some people they just leave their couch on the side of the road when they don't want it anymore, and someone probably will pick it up.
They disappear. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's neat. Well, let's dive in. I'm curious, like, what is the history of couches or this type of product?
Yeah, so we are going to go back to the ancient world. So think Egypt, Greece, ancient Rome. So 3100 BC thereabouts, and this is when the earliest type of couch was created. And these were basically day beds. So if you think back to, I guess any movies that you've seen about ancient Rome, they're kind of reclining back and eating or hanging out, whatever. But this was something that was used by the wealthy. It was a status symbol. These were typically made of wood, and they were very intricate. And they basically were used for eating and socializing, and that was really the first piece of it. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, so kind of the 5th to the 15th century, and the furniture was very utilitarian. And especially if you were in a lower class, these sorts of furniture that you have would be like benches and chests. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you might have a padded seat, but they were really kind of the closest equivalent that we have to a couch, were basically these wooden benches. Then you get to the Renaissance, you start having a little bit more wealth coming in. People are starting to upholster furniture. And that's where you could start to look back and you see pictures and paintings or artifacts like, oh, that's very clearly a sofa or a couch. And these were really statement pieces. These were things that were ornately carved and upholstered in very rich fabrics, because this was kind of heirloom furniture. Well, fast forward to the 19th century, like so many things, once you have the Industrial Revolution, you get mass production. And you start to see the creation of Victoria style couches. So Bridgerton's out. I don't know if you're in Bridgerton. My wife is, but those sorts of couches, that's what we're talking about. And these things are typically very, very heavy. They had buttons on the upholstery. They were curved backs. They had ornate woodwork, and that's really what sofas were considered at that point. And then you kind of go a little bit further. We're talking early 20th century, so 1900, 1910. You start getting Art Deco inspiration. You get streamlined designs, luxurious materials. You start seeing the first uses of leather and chrome, and that's where the piece. And then things start to really increase, and they become more popular. So kind of mid-century, you start to see some very famous designers like Le Corbusier, Charles and Ray Ames, or designers, if you're in the space, that were really, really big into that. This is where you start to see modernist couches, minimalist designs, things like that. And that was really what it was up until the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s. And this is where you start to see the introduction of sectional sofas. And those really became a staple in the living rooms. And so the way I think about it is, that the opening credits of The Simpsons, when they're all running into the couch.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of a new thing, because had The Simpsons been created or put together in the 1960s or 1970s, they wouldn't have been running to a couch. But because it started in the 90s, that was really kind of indicative of what America was like at that given point in time. And now you look at the 21st century, and you're starting to see all of these infusions of technology into couches. So whether they be charging ports, speakers, adjustable foot raiser, things like that. But that's really where the market's been. So it's interesting where everything has changed, but it also is basically the same, where people are lounging about. That's really the purpose of the couch.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how it's changed over time in terms of what comfort looks like and how they're made and all that. And I think it's neat too, because the industry is just massive. We've covered beauty, we've covered alcohol, we've covered so many different industries on e-commerce on tap. But furniture, it's pretty remarkable how fast it's growing. So the global furniture market was valued at $541 billion in 2023, and it's projected to grow to $780 billion by 2030. So it's growing at over 5.3%, which is, I think that's faster than beauty and alcohol. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. The growth is primarily driven by increasing, disposable income, growth of hospitality and housing sectors, and developments. There's so much commercial development going on. And if you think about it too, every hotel room that you stay in, usually there's like a little bit of a couch or a lounge chair. I mean, that's, considered part of the global furniture industry as well. And we've had experiences at Sourcify sourcing for different, commercial developers or hotel developers that, want to get this furniture directly from a factory. So it makes a lot of sense. And the, specific segment of sofa and couches is projected to grow 7.1%. And it's just this kind of increasing wave of millennials trying to buy homes, and also, oftentimes older homes that require more refurbishment to kind of, boost that aesthetic. So the market's growing a ton. And I think this, somewhat compares to Lovesac, right? And I guess I'm curious, from your perspective, how does this growth as a market compare with Lovesac right now?
Well, they're certainly taking advantage of the trends, and in many cases, they are the ones that are setting the tempo or the tone. So they are the fastest growing furniture company in the US. They've got incredibly strong brand loyalty. I mean, even if you don't own one, when we say Lovesac, you know we're talking furniture. Like it's people know what that is at this point. But they're known for sustainability. They're known for innovation. And even though their couches index on the expensive side, their modularity, the ability that they're able to kind of morph with you and change as your life is changing, has really carved out this very interesting niche in the market for them. And so they are well positioned to continue to lead in this sector.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they've got, smart furniture coming out, as we'll touch on. They've got a lot of different trends that they're following. But the founding story is pretty phenomenal here. So Lovesac was founded in 1995 by Shawn David Nelson. And before starting the company, he went on a 2-year mission to Taiwan for the Church of Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church, and he learned Chinese in the process. And Aaron, I think you had a similar experience on a mission in Sweden. Is that right?
Yeah, that's where I picked up Swedish. If you look on my LinkedIn, I say I'm a Swedish speaking taco aficionado. The Swedish speaking came from serving a mission for my church, so it was a good experience, and I definitely relate to kind of some of the stuff that he went through.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think too, one thing that I've learned living in Utah is that from my understanding, not only does the mission, teach you another language, but it also teaches you how to sell, right? Because, basically right after Shawn gets back from his mission, he works as a cell phone salesman in a kiosk, and he got his, BA in Mandarin Chinese and Asian studies with an emphasis on business from the University of Utah. And, he opened at the same time, he opened his first physical store. And then he got a master's in strategic and design management from Parsons, the new school. And, it's pretty incredible because in 2005, Shawn won a $1 million investment from Virgin's Richard Branson on the Rebel Billionaire and was made acting president of Virgin Worldwide for a time. So, I mean, that's pretty incredible to be at that age in 2005 to win $1 million from Richard Branson and then kind of become the quote unquote acting president of Virgin Worldwide. That's pretty awesome. Shawn currently resides in St. George, Utah with his wife, Tiffany, and 4 kids. And he wrote a book with, his wisdom for entrepreneurs. I think he wanted to write something different than just a business book. It was a story of the Lovesac company, his role in it, and what he's learned so far. It's called Mistakes, Miracles, and Lessons. And it's, I think a great book. I haven't read it yet, but I bought it on Amazon and going to read it when it arrives. So I think Shawn, considers just activity to be the key. Buy a nice couch, as he says, and when you use it, make it count, but don't use it too much. So I think he really lives a great lifestyle here, and he doesn't consider himself a quote unquote couch guy.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's so many interesting things here, but you know, I think that he's been defined by this couch company that he's created, and even though he doesn't consider himself a couch guy, he still believes and recognizes that people need a nice place to recover from their activity. So he has the perspective of like, hey, I'm not making this for the couch potato. I'm making this for someone who, they may only be on this couch for half an hour a day, and we want it to be as awesome as possible. And so, he wants people to spend less time on the couch, but to be a better time, a better quality piece that's on there. And so, yeah, it's just interesting guy in general. I mean, he kind of has this interesting theme that comes out as I was doing some research, where he's a bit of a contrarian. And so on the one hand, he sells couches, but doesn't want people to use them more. We'll talk about this later, but their products are meant to last a lifetime instead of constantly requiring upgrades. And so how do you keep growing a business? They use a bunch of recycled plastic bottles in their couches, but they don't really push the sustainability angle. And so I'm just curious, what's your perspective as far as what this says, this contrarian kind of mentality says about his approach to business?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think as we'll dive into the story, it kind of shows that, he likes to get things done, but also likes to enjoy his life, right? He's a surfer, he travels, he has a family, he does a lot. And so I think that just goes to show in terms of his lifestyle and how he's run this business. And the story really begins like as a side hustle, right? Because the company started in his parents' basement when he was 18. And he initially handmade the furniture and delivered it to other students in university. And as it attracted interest, he decided to start a company, right? So in 1998, he registered the Lovesac name, and that officially begins the company. It kind of started as like a giant baseball shaped bean bag, and he thought it was funny to try to make the world's largest bean bag. So kind of started like a bit like, I don't know, in a jokingly way, if you will. And to kind of make these bean bags, he bought foam leftovers from furniture companies. They also lent him their foam shredder, and he would take these sacks to different events, and he eventually attracted the attention of Red Bull. And so like I think Shawn, he didn't necessarily like believe this could spawn into a big company despite having sales. But I guess I'm curious, like, what do you think his rationale was at the time? Because in 2001, he gets a big order of 12,000 sacks that are bought by a store. So I guess I'm curious, like from your perspective, he seems to have started this thinking this is going to be a side hustle, but then he gets this big order. What do you think is going through his mind at that time?
Well, yeah, as you mentioned, he was kind of considering, do I shut this down? I mean, just think about this. He started in 1995. 1998, this is really when the internet is basically beginning for all intents and purposes. He registers the domain. And then, it's basically 6 years of selling beanbags. And so I imagine that, he had graduated a few years prior. He was trying to start his life, probably starting a family, looking at these sorts of things. And so I think there's probably an element here where it's like, dude, you gonna grow up? like what are you doing here? Are you gonna keep doing this side hustle thing, or do you think this could be something that's interesting? And so I can definitely respect that. Certainly, there are jobs that we've both had when we were younger that maybe we wouldn't do now, or there's things that we're doing now that we wouldn't want to do 10, 15 years from now. And so you're just in a different spot in your life as far as what you want out of that entrepreneurship journey. But as you're right, things really changed in 2001 when a single chain put an order for 12,000 sacks. And so this was obviously a huge deal. And whether or not he was kind of on the fence, he got very abruptly pulled off of the fence and said, okay, you've got to at least fill this order because it's way too much. And so he recognized that a lot of the fabrics that he was pulling from, right? So he was getting these scraps. He was able to see that the suppliers that he was getting the scraps from were sourcing this fabric from China. And again, because he had been to Taiwan and could read Chinese, he was able to read the contract details. And so he was able to figure out, okay, this is exactly where this stuff's coming from. This is where it is. And so he goes to China and finds a way to manufacture these sacks in a way that's way cheaper than what they're able to do in the US. And again, think this is 2001 timeframe. This is right when China is opening up. This is right when they've been accepted into the World Trade Organization. And this is really the beginning of China becoming the manufacturing floor. This was something that was, you had to be native in order to figure out. That infrastructure didn't exist. Sourcify didn't exist, right? I think you were like, what, 15, 16? I don't know. But like, because he could speak Chinese, he was able to kind of be sneaky, right? So he would go and he'd sit in these meetings with the Chinese suppliers, and he'd speak to them in English, and then they would talk among themselves in Chinese about what their actual costs were, and they would basically say, oh, it costs us this, we could charge them that. What about this? And he just played dumb. He understood every word, but he would kind of use that as insight to say, when they say, hey, it's costing us $15 to make this. And then they tell him in English, hey, we the best we can do is $30. He's like, well, actually, I think 18 is a fair price. And so, that's the sort of things that he would play with. But he did this for about a year, going through all of this, and eventually he revealed to one of his providers that he was fluent in Chinese, and they were shocked. They were spellbound, but they went on to have a very, very long business relationship. And despite all of this work of going through and figuring out how they're going to make the 12,000 sacks, this was not a profitable order for him. It basically allowed him to break even, but he got the taste of producing at scale. And so I'm just curious, this whole idea of kind of hiding the fact that you're fluent in Chinese. Do you have any stories like that just from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, there were some times when I would just lead with English and kind of be like the token, white guy in the factory, if you will. But I never let it go for a year. I mean, maybe to like the end of our factory visit, then I would start speaking Mandarin, just because I wanted to understand how the factory would interact with each other and their team and so forth. But I never let it kind of go for a year without telling them. I typically would always start speaking Mandarin by the end of the tour. And it is unique and neat when you kind of can understand what someone is saying about you and they don't think that you understand them. There's definitely been some times where I've been in China and they're talking about this tall guy or whatever it may be, and I know what they're saying. It's pretty funny experience. But yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to me that he didn't make a ton of money on that initial order, but I think it's just him first dialing in production and understanding his costs, and then really approaching his factory to get a lower cost to actually become more profitable on these orders. But he built his first warehouse and factory by maxing out as many credit cards as he could for himself, and he also got like a agriculture loan to get a tractor to run the agriculture machines he got to use to operate for like the foam shredders. So that was kind of neat, like a unique way to finance the equipment that he needed. And their first, exactly. And then their first sales calls with retail stores were a big failure. And that's where and why they learned that they would need to have their own store. So I think his approach, because, he got this big order to start from a chain, was to call other stores. But that didn't work out, and they had to open up their own stores, and that's what they did. And so later that year, without any clients and maxing out his cousin's credit cards too, Lovesac opens its first store in a mall. And they were worried, like, are we going to get laughed out of the mall? What's the reaction going to be? And a month later, however, they sold their first franchise, and they would continue to grow through this business model. So by selling sacks, they then found out that clients were interested in couches, and they looked for ways to make couches easier to pack and deliver. And by doing that and researching and developing this whole new type of kind of couch, that's when they created Sactionals, which is their modular couch. And I guess it's interesting because, like, I'm just curious, you don't hear too many stories where a business starts franchising like this early, and especially a furniture business. So I mean, I'm curious just to hear your reaction to that, Aaron.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing is, you look at this and they have a very similar playbook where if you were going to start this company in 2024, you're like, oh, yeah, of course, having your own stores makes sense, and having an e-commerce website makes sense, and producing overseas in China makes sense. They were just like literally 20 years earlier than everybody else. And so much of this was the first time that it had been done for many of these cases. And so, yeah, I mean, it's kind of scary. It's kind of reckless a little bit to say, let me finance my business off of my personal credit cards and launch a store, and hopefully that the store goes well. Otherwise, I have to declare bankruptcy, and my cousin has to declare bankruptcy, and here I am trying to start my life.
Yeah, and so they got patents for their Sactional type of product, and it quickly became the star product for the company. And they did really well with it. But then I think kind of surprisingly, in some sense, in 2006, the company had to file Chapter 11 protection. And basically what happened is Lovesac had a piece of real estate that was appraised at $34 million that their lender loaned $2.8 million against. But it turns out that the company split the water rights from the real estate and retained the water rights that dramatically reduced the values of the underlying asset for the lender who sued them. So their lender sued them, which put them in a super tough spot. And I guess, they didn't have the money to fight that lawsuit. And so they ended up filing for Chapter 11 protection. And, that was in January 2006, and they emerged out of it in August after resolving the complaint. And, shortly after this, the company would continue to operate normally, but it definitely was a big kind of blip, if you will, in their story, because, being sued by their lender for this water rights issue and their underlying asset, like almost, put them out of business.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird thing where I'm sure that the real estate was related to the business, but this seems like it was such a distraction, right? Like I don't know the details of it. I couldn't find much about it, but you know, why was this even a thing? And then why did they want to divorce the water rights from the real estate? I mean, there's so much stuff here that seems to have been a distraction that uh, pulled the company into bankruptcy, but the actual underlying company itself was doing great, was doing fine. And actually, the business continued to grow as a private company, without any sort of hiccups, starting in 2006, all the way through June of 2018. That's when they filed for their IPO, and they went public with a market cap of about 250 million at the time. So their opening share price was $16. They sold about 3.5 million shares, and day one it popped up to $24. And so they were able to raise 56 million. At the time of the IPO in 2018, they had 70 stores, and the media was really interested in not only these stores but what they're able to do from a digital age. I mean, they were again one of the early pioneers in selling furniture online, and this was really one of their core competencies. And so that was really what was interesting to analysts. Sales were growing at 33% year over year as a company, but the internet sales were growing at 54% year over year. And so it was a massive, massive growth. And, even despite all that growth, the brand in 2018 had relatively low brand recognition. They had relatively small market share. And so they had this enormous upside they could go through. And I think one of the fun things too is that their ticker symbol is LOVE, which I think is awesome as like a ticker symbol.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I think too, like the IPO helped with their brand recognition, which was probably one of the reasons they decided to go public. But yeah, it's been interesting to see how they performed as a public company. Lovesac today, their couches are the number one sold couch in America. Their Sactional products is already 16 years old and still relevant. So it's pretty incredible to have a product still be relevant after 16 years. The company does invest a ton in marketing, and they do not offer discounts. They really just focus on investing in brand marketing. And the business is really driven by, value instead of discounts. And now they have over 300 locations. And during COVID, they grew a ton, as you can imagine. So many people were shopping for furniture and dealing with all the supply chain delays. And I think Lovesac today is probably the only furniture company that's still growing, which is pretty amazing. They're profitable. They're building they're building more cash flow and cash, and they're outperforming the category as a whole. And their brand recognition is now considered basically best in class in this category. And so they've been looking at expanding into other furniture categories moving forward. And Shawn believes most furniture companies are merchant led, and he sees Lovesac being customer centric and really focusing on the product, which to me, if you look at most furniture brands, like they really are kind of like merchant or store led, whereas this kind of seems to be operating a bit more by like a CPG brand in some sense. And I'm curious, did you have kind of that same census around like, is this Lovesac furniture company almost operating as a CPG brand?
Yeah, I did, and I kind of want to qualify what I meant by that. So typically, if you were to look at at the profile of a furniture company, they're going to be a make to order type of company, right? They're going to kind of their preference is going to be to say we might have some in a showroom, but by and large, if you're going to order, especially online, you're going to wait some time for that. Whereas a CPG company is going to be make to stock. And that basically entails that you've got everything that's available and you can get it to them pretty immediately. And you think about the cogs on a couch, and you think about all the different configurations and things like that. Is an expensive endeavor to try to hold the amount of inventory necessary to be very reactive to customer response. I remember we had a company we were advising a few years ago, and they were a furniture company producing really great furniture out of Thailand. And the founder wanted to go from a make to order to a make to stock mentality. And at the time, I was like, I don't know about that. Like, you're going to need a couple $1,000,000 just in inventory to deal with all the different colors and variations that you have, just so that you're there for someone to have it. But I think what the genius of what Lovesac has been able to do is because of their modularity, they actually don't have to hold, all of the different combinations of their SKUs. They can actually just say, all right, what are the building blocks that go into these sectionals, and let's hold inventory of that. And we will let people customize and build these things out. And so in some ways, they're doing a little bit of postponement, where you're going to order something, you can configure online, and they're going to take your order and break that down into the 8 or 9 different SKUs that you actually ordered. And that's what they're able to forecast. That's what they're able to do. And they have enough demand in those baseline items that it makes sense to hold inventory, to hold safety stock, and do those sorts of things. So it's really fascinating, where I don't know if any other company could pull it off in this way, because one, they have the modularity in their design, and two, they have the overall demand where that inventory is going to turn. It's not something that sits in a warehouse for 6 or 9 months.
Yeah, I agree. I like that take, and I think their targeting is kind of similar to a lot of CPG brands too, in terms of being millennial focused. It's kind of like a Netflix and chill vibe type of couch, if you will. And I think when people are renting more and maybe want to adapt to different style of housing, these sectionals are really useful. And Shawn continues to mention, as I looked at different interviews that he's been in, that he's focused on building a company for the next 100 years, and that he was never really interested in quote unquote exiting or in selling. And so he's invested in the company in the long run, which is pretty amazing to see. And I think he does that with the customer relationships that they have and their team, and really just overall how they interact with their brand. I think it's pretty amazing. And I think too, like, it's interesting to see, with kind of, as you were mentioning, how their company invests in innovation and in design, and they're always hiring different industrial designers to get patented innovations within furniture, which I'm not quite sure if other furniture companies are really investing that much in industrial design, but it really stuck out to Lovesac. It's pretty unique just in terms of how much they kind of try to blend tech with their furniture. Do you think it's a real lasting part that's going to separate Lovesac from other furniture companies?
I don't know. I think anytime you are on the bleeding edge of something and you're going after early adopters, you're going to get more wrong than you get right. So, think back when they were coming up with the replacement for the VCR. There was Blu-ray, there was DVD, there was Laserdisc, there was all these things that were out there that were the cool new thing at the time. And there were whole companies and industries that were popping up around some sort of standard. I mean, shoot, just look at iPhone. They can't get their chargers right, where it's like, lightning cord one time, and now it's the USB-C thing. And you've got to redo everything. So my concern with being at the forefront of embedding technology into furniture is, 10, 15, 20 years from now, are you going to have something that is useful, right? Imagine if they had put a phone jack into the couch, right? They had, a phone that connected in, you're able to use it. Like, that would have been cool maybe in the 90s, but it would just be, maybe it's cool now because it's retro. But my concern would be that if you're embedding things that inherently aren't an accepted standard, then it's possible that you're going to age out and people will have to get rid of it because it's like, hey, we don't use these things anymore. That being said, like, I think what Lovesac has in its back pocket is its modularity, and so they're able to swap things out and say, hey, this used to be the wireless charging standard that people were using, and we've moved past that 5 or 10 years. So here's a piece that you can do to replace that aspect of it, as opposed to need to go out and buy a whole new couch.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, if we talk about kind of their ethos of design for life products, that drives all their innovation, right? And I think that's really what sets them apart. They say they market the couches as something you can live through. You should not be afraid to mess them up. And, really, Lovesac is made up of 3 main products. They're modular couches that are built to last. They're bean bags that they call sacks. and their stealth tech, which are like kind of tech add-ons to their couches. And this is kind of a newer line of product that, they should be positioned to take a part of rising trends in the industry. And, stealth tech, it's nice. It's not, as visible as a lot of these other kind of chargers and different couches. And, the quality of the sound from like a speaker standpoint is amazing as well. And so it's kind of like a sound system that you can continue to take with you as you move and bring your couches to new places that you're living in, which is kind of neat. So I like their lineup, and I really do like the ethos of like design for life. I think that does strike a chord with a lot of people in today's world.
So yeah, when it comes to this idea of, do we make something that inherently is long lasting, I think it's a really interesting question, because you look at most big CPG companies or most big companies in general, it's all about repeat purchase. It's about making things that have planned obsolescence. It's about making things that you're going to need to consume over and over again, because that's how you increase your profits. And so it's a really interesting take where, I wonder if Lovesac were not growing at the rate that they're growing at right now, if they would be forced to maybe make some of those trade-offs. But right now they don't have to. And it's this really interesting piece where I think that in general, society is starting to shift more toward quality. It used to be, hey, get me the cheapest thing possible and I'll just have disposable whatever. But at least I see, and certainly I think the data bears it out, where people are looking for fewer things that are going to last longer and are going to do well. And so I do think it's something that companies should be considering right now, because the last thing you want to do is be considered a cheap product, because that's just a race to the bottom.
Totally. I agree. And, if we look at their company milestones, it's pretty amazing just to see their growth trajectory, right? So, 1995, Shawn creates, his first beanbag. 2006, then Shawn wins the Rebel Billionaire that attracts investor interest in his company. And, they that was the year they got sued. They had to file Chapter 11. They were, a bit struggling, but continue to grow tremendously after that year, really set up a strong foundation. I think partially with those investor connections. 2018, this is when Lovesac goes public under the ticker Love, and they go public on the Nasdaq. 2019, revenue of 166 million. 2020, 233 million. 2021, 321 million. 2022, 498 million. And 2023, 651 million. And these are confirmed numbers because they're public, so we can see these numbers, and anyone could based on their stock and their annual reports. And 2024, since they've gone public, they're growing at almost just an incredible clip, right? They're just continuing to grow as a public company, but there's been some bad sentiment around the stock. I think kind of besides seeing itself as a growth stock, it kind of seems like maybe more like a value stock than a growth stock in terms of how it's performed. So I think there was a lot of promises on the tech side, but the stock is currently valued lower than its IPO level, and it's fluctuated quite a bit. Like many furniture companies, it spiked during COVID and has since cooled off. It's still performing well, but it's interesting because their revenue growth is definitely not reflective of their stock price. And so I guess I'm curious, like, why do you think investors are struggling to get their hands around Lovesac?
Well, I also, look at them. They're on the Nasdaq, which is the tech uh, exchange. So one, it's just, who are they being compared against? They're being compared against all of these other major big tech companies. And so, yeah, if you're trying to, I don't know if Nvidia or Apple or Tesla are on those exchanges or on the NICE, but when you're compared against those types of companies, yeah, you're going to look like a growth stock. And like, that's not a bad thing. It's just your valuations are going to be determined more by a multiple of profit than they are around revenue growth. And so you just run a business differently. And so I don't think it's a bad thing, but depending on what Shawn is hoping to, I mean, he wants to build a company that lasts for 100 years. He's got to find investors that are willing to kind of go along with that. And so many traders today, so many stock owners today, whether it be Robinhood or professional trainers, are looking at stocks and they're holding them for hours, right? Days, weeks at the longest. And so it is a more difficult piece, but again, I think that they're profitable, they're growing, they're saving cash, they're in a really strong position just to keep going. And it really just the stock valuation is just how the market is voting on that company. But maybe there's a world where someone is going to come after them. But when they've got that big of a war chest, uh, unless their stock completely craters and someone else decides that it's undervalued, they're going to continue to consist as an ongoing entity.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's interesting too because we did a supply chain deep dive, obviously, and what was unique is that they have a great omni-channel strategy, but they do not wholesale to anyone. So even in Best Buy, they control the locations, the checkout, etc. They kind of operate their own shop within there, and it's a really good partnership with for their stealth tech product. And they also, of course, have their direct-to-consumer brand where you can buy their products on their own website, and also too with furniture, I think physical locations are really just critical in this industry. And so since purchases are for a higher ticket, they want to be able to experience it themselves. So they have, a ton of retail locations now in order for people to do that. I think the hard part is, getting good at operating these physical locations, right? There's, staff, overhead, leases, locations, you name it. There's just so much that goes into operating a retail location in a fluid manner. But most transactions happen at the showroom. And, though buyers are digital first, they will go to the stores. And these stores don't hold stock. So people can buy from anywhere, but, the sales channels won't get impacted because of that. And they had their, own website from the onset. And, it's interesting because I think like Warby Parker, Casper, and like even Tesla were kind of good examples as I thought about their supply chain in terms of the path that they wanted to follow. I mean, when you were looking at their supply chain, did it remind you in some sense of like a Warby Parker or Casper?
I mean, Casper would be a good analogy. But, the piece that I want to kind of loop back to is how hard the distribution is for D2C for furniture and for these big and bulkies. I mean, it's one of those things where because they're so big, you can't put them to the regular post office. And so you're going to find people that are only able to make deliveries of a couple of these units a day. And so that inherently means that you have to have lots of locations. They probably have 150, 200 locations across the US where they're storing inventory. There's only a handful of carriers that are even in this business that will have the infrastructure to hold that forward deployed stock, to organize crews that will come in and pick them up and deliver them on a regular basis. And then, oh, by the way, you want to be able to offer a good customer experience as well. It's not enough just to get something that is big and bulky and is sitting in your driveway on your front porch, but you've got to schedule the right time. They have to be home. You have to deal with no shows. You have to make sure that the people who are delivering the product look presentable. They have to go into someone's home. They have to do all these things where it's all of those touch points are major impacts on the brand, and so it's a very important piece to do with your partners. And so I didn't want to go past that because it was such an interesting part and such a unique part that I think most brands that are just doing D2C through parcel I don't have to deal with.
Yeah, that's a really, really unique point. And it's kind of funny because, like, Shawn's quoted saying in 2024, D2C is now almost a bad word, which is kind of funny and relates to their strategy. But, one thing that I love is they are truly sustainable. They make a lot of their plastic bottles, they recycle into fabric that then is used in a lot of their couches. And they also, enable people to trade in old couch modules if they want to change the look of their couch. And I think that's, amazing. I think more and more consumers are conscious of, their environment and sustainability measures and what companies are doing around that. And, post COVID, they've had a lot of constraints from a supply chain perspective that, have definitely affected their business. I think every company was back ordered that sold furniture during COVID. So they definitely related to this. And their sourcing team achieved better costs during 2023 that increased their margins, resulting in better financial performance in 2023. Their gross margin grew, and they import mostly from China and Vietnam, but they also have suppliers in India, Malaysia, Indonesia. And according to their founder, Shawn, Lovesac planned to move 75% of its production out of China by 2020 due to the trade war tariffs. As of late 2019, 40% of Lovesac's manufacturing was done in Vietnam and Malaysia, which were, free of those tariff impacts during that time. So they didn't quite hit that metric of moving out of China, but they definitely taken strides to do so. And I think it's interesting because, you and I have been working in this industry for, over a decade now. And I think so many people during kind of the trade war dynamic, they really were like, hey, we're done with China, we're moving out. And I think what most companies faced and realized was that there's not a lot of factories outside of China that can handle their products. And so I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on this? Hearing what Shawn had said, during the kind of increase in tariffs and him wanting to move production, and they moved a good amount of it, but obviously they weren't able to move as much as they wanted.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, in some cases, regulation can move much faster than physical supply chains, and so a tariff that goes up, there's always this calculus of, is this something that's going to be around for a couple months, a year? Is it going to last an administration, and the next guy's going to take it down? So that's a difficult part. But really, the trend that we're seeing just across every industry is twofold. It's either this idea that, hey, we want to decouple from China, and that's the general trend. And that doesn't mean that we don't work with China, but most brands that I work with and I talk to are taking a China plus one manufacturing strategy. And it goes to exactly what you're talking about, where they recognize that, we've got 20 or 30 years of some cases of building out the most amazing infrastructure and relationships that have ever existed on planet Earth in terms of making stuff. We can't just throw all that away. And so you're still getting good deals from China. It's still an important part. It's where you would go to do things on a massive level. But they're recognizing that, maybe it's worth a couple margin points to have China and Vietnam, or China and Mexico, or, let me have a couple of these different options in case tariffs pop up, or in case there's currency changes, or heaven forbid, there's some sort of conflict that goes on and trade becomes impossible between the two countries. And so this China plus one strategy is a major trend. And I just encourage anybody to who's only sole sourced into China, just to look at your options to know what you'd have, because the time to think about getting out of China and trying to find that other partner it's too late if you're waiting for something bad to happen to your Chinese entity.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, we've seen it so much at Sourcify. We've helped a lot of our customers that were solely based in China move to, Vietnam, India, really all over Southeast Asia. And it takes time. That is for sure. It definitely takes time. In terms of their imports, most of their imports are going to Long Beach, California. There's also some shipments going to New York. So, they also use two different ports in general. But, I'm curious, like Shawn mentions this kind of like race to innovate. If you talk, and hear him speaking about Lovesac and their earnings call and whatnot. And, they've already exited in some sense because they're a public company, right? I'm just curious in terms of your thoughts on Shawn just growing Lovesac to this massive, multi-$100 million a year furniture company from his parents' basement. I mean, it's really a remarkable story.
Yeah, I'm putting Shawn on the short list of people I'd love to meet sometime and chat and just hear some war stories. But it's pretty remarkable. I think what is interesting about his story for me is the fact that he was almost reluctant into this. There were several moments where, he's like, is this a real thing? I'm sure when he started his first Bing Bag in high school that this was never in his wildest dream was going to turn into a public company that would kind of shape his professional life. So I think that I'd love to kind of hear it from him as far as where were all those little moments that he thought about quitting or thought about doing something different, and why did he think that the grass wasn't green on the other side? Why did he stick with it? So, Shawn, if you're listening, let me know. I'll come out to St. George and we'll play golf or something. But I think it's in terms of the prospects of Lovesac, I'm really interested to see what happens here. There are not very many public companies today that are inherently investing in the future, right? So I think about Dell Computers was public, and then Michael Dell took them private because he wanted to make some investments. He wanted to do things that were going to make it better. Ford, same thing. Public company went private, now it's public again. And so it's very interesting where they are choosing to invest and have a long-term perspective in an environment that rewards profits today and revenue growth today, and not necessarily revenue growth 20 years from now. And so to some extent, I wonder if they would get to where they wanted to go faster if they were to go private again, if they were to team up with some private equity and take the company private, allow them to not have to worry about the quarterly reports and the SEC filings, but really just say, okay, we are doing $700-800 million right now. Our thought is that in the next 5 years we can grow this to $2 or $3 billion, and once we do that, we're going to go public again, and we're going to be at a $30 billion valuation or whatever it's going to be. And so I think that the key thing is it's important to plan for the long term, but I also think that Lovesac needs to educate their investors, their team, their employees about what are the milestones along the way, because you can't plant seeds for tomorrow forever. At some point, you have to eat today.
Totally. I love that line. I think that was a really unique take. And I think Shawn is enjoying this moment too, right? Because most companies seem to be struggling. After COVID, they had a huge spike. Now they've slowed down, and Lovesac is continuing to do well. So I think it's a moment that will weed out multiple competitors that he has. And a lot of them, might not outlive, these years after COVID, whereas Lovesac is continuing to grow and do more and more. So it's pretty remarkable. I mean, I think my takeaways are just how long the journey is, right? A lot of people in today's world starting e-commerce brands, they want to get to $100 million in revenue in 3 years, I mean, it took Lovesac basically like almost 10 years to get there. So just over 10 years. Right. And now, after, almost, 15, 20 years, it's like over $500 million in revenue. It's just incredible. But, I think there's something to be said about going slow to go fast. Right. I think that's probably my takeaway from this episode of E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA. Any final parting notes here, Aaron, as we wrap up this fantastic episode?
If you have a chance to go to the store or to jump on a Lovesac, it's a lot of fun. I recommend it. They're pretty comfy.
They are super comfy. Definitely. Next time you're, in Manhattan or, wherever it may be that they have one of their, 300 plus locations, definitely try it out. I highly recommend it. And this was awesome. Thank you again, everyone, for listening in. Please like, subscribe, share. And Aaron and I post these episodes every week on LinkedIn. So we'd love to hear your comments. Just check out our LinkedIns. We post them on LinkedIn and would love to hear what you think. Any comments, anything that stood out, let us know. And thank you again for listening in to this episode of E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA.